Dearly beloved, I have brought you here together today to learn a little bit more American history. So I'm telling you about the House divided. I'm going to do my Bob Dylan thing. The North was in the Thrall of Change, just beginning to, well, first of all, the House divided, of course, North and South are going different directions. The North, of course, is in the Thrall of Change, just incredibly transformed by urbanization, immigration, and industrialization, making it head off in a different direction, of course, the direction ultimately of modernization. But it left the people kind of bewildered by it, so they sort of feel overwhelmed by the change. They seek to confront that if they possibly can through a variety of reform activities. That we see among these reform activities the revivals that I told you about with Charles Finney and friends, and utopian communities like the Shakers, who simply tried to remove themselves from the larger society and prepared themselves for the coming of the kingdom of heaven. Now, not all of the reforms that occurred in the antebellum North were religious. Indeed, there are important secular reforms that I'd like to highlight for you. And one of the most important by far are the educational reforms that began in the North in the antebellum period. What we really have happening here is the foundations of the modern American public school system. It really wasn't there. I told you in the colonial era, it's just kind of a structure of education, not more than, or a methodology, a process of education, no structure to it whatsoever. By the time we get to the antebellum period, there's a call in the North. There needs to be a structure to this. So we have the foundations and the beginnings of the American public school system. Now, in the issues of those things associated with the rise of public school education reform, there is sort of a founding person, a founding figure, if you will. And he was a man by the name of Man. I'm not sure if you're supposed to say Manan when you have someone who has two N's at the end of their name. But his name was Horace Mann, and Horace Mann, of course, is the founding father of the American public school system, but also a potential identification on your final exam. So I hope that you guys want to get a little bit of this information in there. Now, Horace Mann was a member of the legislature of the state of Massachusetts. And on one particular day in the 1830s, he stood up to give a speech. And in the speech, he was highly critical of the ways that the children of Massachusetts were being educated. And it's one of those moments where, be careful how you complain because everyone can turn on you. So the legislature kind of turned on him and they decided, well, if there's a problem, we want you to fix it. So Horace Mann became the first ever Secretary of Education for the state of Massachusetts. And I do want you guys to know that there really wasn't there's no other office like this anywhere in America. There's not going to be a Secretary of Education on a cabinet level until the 20th century, later part of the 20th century. So Horace Mann was the first person ever in the history of the United States who was put in charge of an educational system. And he embraced it. I have to tell you, he embraced the challenge. He said, okay, let's make this sucker work. And what he will do is he will conduct a series of reforms that will begin to create the foundation of a public school system for Massachusetts, and Massachusetts will become the model for the entire North. Everyone's going to pretty much emulate what Horace Mann did, and they're going to make it happen all across the entire North by the end of the antebellum period. So here are the famous reforms that were instituted by Horace Mann to establish the foundations of the public school system. The first one was he was the first to call for what we call a regular and minimum school year. The regular and minimum school year is a reform instituted under Horace Mann. Up until that time, there wasn't anything regular about it at all. Just you kind of caught an education when you could. The story of Abraham Lincoln is kind of indicative of the situation. So he had, I can't remember what it was like, 8 months of formal schooling or something like that. And none of it was like consecutive. You catch a week here, a month there, and he's pretty much what we call an autodidact, a self-taught individual. And that's the way most people had to be at that time, So there wasn't any structure to it. There could be a school, maybe there was. There could be a teacher. And oftentimes it had to do, of course, with the nature of the economy. Mom and dad did not want their kids off going to school, of course, in the spring because it was time for the planting. They didn't want them gone in the fall because that was the time for the harvest. All these kind of things. So like a little bit of school in the middle of winter and a little bit of school in the middle of summer, something like that was all you could get. And Mann said, that doesn't work. We need to have a regular and minimum school year. So he decided upon a school year that would begin more or less, of course, in August, September, and that would last more or less until May to June or something like that. And do note that this is an indication of an increasingly urban industrial society, that he didn't care about the spring planting and he didn't care about the fall harvest. That's not as important, of course, for urban industrial people, but it's more important that we educate these children as best we possibly could. Associated with this, of course, was a system of gradation that you come in at one grade, first grade, second grade, going through each regular and minimum school year in a cycle, of course, to advance yourself through the educational process. So the first promoter of the regular and minimum school year was Horace Mann. Horace Mann was also a pioneer in the area of teacher training. So he wanted teachers to know what they were doing. He wanted them to have the basic, what we call pedagogical skills, the skills of teaching children. Up until that time, it was kind of happenstance who would be a teacher. And routinely the teachers were men, and routinely the teachers were just men on their way to becoming a professional. So the guy at one point, he'll be a lawyer, but he's not quite there, but he has an education. He knows how to read and write and figure and do those basic things, and that was good enough. He would spend some of his off time teaching the kids of the neighborhood or something like that, okay? Well, Mann said this isn't good enough. We need teachers who actually have these particular skills. Now, don't think that he started a credential problem, because that's not what's happening yet. That's going to be in much later development. But he created an examination system where you had to prove through examination that you could do this stuff, that you had the grammatical skills, that you had the mathematical skills to teach the things that were necessary to the students. And the intriguing thing that happened, he put on an examination process. Almost all those pre-professional men who'd been teachers drop out of it. They don't want to go through that stuff, okay? And it was mostly young women who said, I'll prepare for that. I'm willing to do that, okay? And it begins this kind of predominance of women as elementary school teachers especially. They're willing to get the training, of course, willing to take the examinations, pass the examinations, so they could become the teachers, all right? But the first to implement the concept of teacher training was indeed Horace Mann. Horace Mann was also fundamentally important in the rise of what we call the secular curriculum. So the curriculum is what is being taught to the students. I told you that in colonial America, the primary way that they would teach their, it's the parents, homeschooling, right? And they would use the Bible. And so, in that case, the Bible is not so much, it is a religious document, that's true, but it's just simply a vehicle of learning. There's something the kids can use. But, it wasn't that Horace Mann was against using, he wasn't against, of course, Christianity, he wasn't against Protestantism, wasn't even against prayer in the classroom. For him, that would be fine. But he wanted the focus of the education to be on secular curricula. So this comes forward, of course, in something that we sometimes call the 3 R's, which of course is very ironic because only one of the words starts with R, but reading, writing, and arithmetic, These were the things that they would begin to kind of focus on. And my cat is coughing over here. George, are you okay? Got a fur ball or something like that. I love that they come up and spend their time with me. Anyway, so, he wanted the focus of the educational process to be on reading and writing, of course, language skills, language arts, whatever you want to call that, mathematical skills, geography, history, all of those kind of things become the essence. So the focus of these emerging public schools is not going to be on religion. It's going to be on the secular curriculum, what the students will be basically taught, okay? Finally, and one of his most famous reforms was that he, up until that time, basically the schooling is going to about grade 8. It's interesting that was the level for so many people. Both of my grandparents on my father's side simply went to the 8th grade. That was the extent of their education, 8th grade education. And that was, in the early part of the 20th century, and that was okay. And my grandfather, he was a white-collar worker in a meatpacking company in Omaha, Nebraska, worked in the human resources department. So, it could actually work its way out. But, Horace Mann simply thought increasingly that 8th grades it's not enough. There needs to be more, okay? And so he was the first person to really promote the concept of a higher level of education, and this simply evolved to become the high school. It's intriguing to me that in the antebellum North at that time, of course, the high school was like the moral equivalent of college, a notion that it's a more sophisticated society. We need to increase the level of learning that would take place. We need to increase the sophistication of learning that take place, expose them to, more intense mathematical concepts, scientific concepts, etc. So Horace Mann was the person who's basically the inventor or the founder of the high school concept as far as the United States is concerned. I've been told that there, at least, and it must be much more so in back east, but there are many, many high schools that are named Horace Mann High School in honor, of course, of the individual who really promoted this. Now, as Horace Mann is putting this all together, I do want you to know that there's an intent. Now, the schools were designed to do certain things, and it shouldn't surprise us that it's not just that they're going to educate the kids, but you're trying to deal with the issues of the larger society. it is somewhat problematic that what became the essential focus of public school, more than, and it really wasn't creative thinking, and it wasn't expansive learning. Those are hopefully outcomes that will be part of this, but it was something much more kind of focused than that, and it really had to do with the nature of the larger society. I always like, just to have you think about this. I mean, what do the public schools try to ingrain in our souls more than anything else? Think about what they really try to put inside of us, force us to internalize. And it isn't necessarily, of course, creative thinking, and it isn't necessarily some kind of expansive level of learning or something like that, unfortunately. Instead, it's, kind of this notion that we should always be in class, of course, that we should never be late, that absenteeism is a sin, that tardiness is a sin, that good behavior is the way that things should go. We should always be as good citizens as much as we can in terms of the classroom. These are the kind of things that they really wanted to emphasize more than anything else. And if you think about the notions of, making tardyism a sin, making absenteeism a sin, who is that serving? And it doesn't necessarily serve the teacher, though. I mean, it does. My notion throughout my entire life, of course, is never be late and always be there. So clearly, I was indoctrinating the situation. But it's really designed to serve the worker, to serve the employers. They wanted their students to become good workers, and they would always go to work on time, right? And they'd always be there every single day as long as they possibly could. And the other essential goal was to be a good citizen, So understand that you should be a behaved individual, and give them a proper understanding, of course, of the history of America and a proper foundation of patriotism. I mean, you've got little teeny kids, of course, saying the Pledge of Allegiance before they have any idea what any of the words that they're even saying. These are the things that, and there's nothing wrong with a school being a process of indoctrination. It is, but it just seems a little bit, sad in the long run, of course, that being a good worker and being a good citizen was so much more important than creative thinking, of course, and all the extensions of learning that you might gain from that situation. But understand that they're facing a society, of course, in relative upheaval, and the idea of creating, good workers and good citizens was very appealing to create, to gain order out of the chaos that sort of dominated society at that time. Anyway, by the time we get to 1860, every single northern state has a public school. Not all of them were quite ready to do the high school, but many of them were doing the high schools too. But I think the more interesting thing is that by the time we get to 1860, none of the southern states had any public schools. So it shows that it's really showing us the difference between the North and the South. And the North, of course, really kind of thinking about the generation of generating future generations to do the things that are necessary for the North to allow it to develop and continue on its particular path. Now, because the Northerners were seeking order, they kind of fell in love with something that we call institutions. So institutions are devices that you use to give structure and organization to process. So for instance, Palomar College is an institution of higher learning. So that means what we do is we're trying to create a structure, organization, process for higher learning. So what do? We build a campus, we have classrooms, we hire teachers, of course, we schedule a schedule, we schedule the classes, we allow the students to come in, of course, and take them. One thing that I've always just wanted you to know, and I'm sure you do know, you could learn everything I've taught you on your own. I mean, it's all out there for you if you really wanted, of course. But, instead we try to ease this process by creating the college, creating the classroom, creating the professor to be there, of course, the class schedules, all these kind of things to assist this. So institutions bring order to whatever it is you're trying to do. And because the Northerners were so interested in trying to regain order from the chaos that they felt around them, they sort of fell in love with the concept of the institution. And they're going to use it in a variety of different ways. Probably the most interesting application, though, and this is such an intriguingly American thing that's going to happen here, is that the Americans will basically invent this concept called the penitentiary. And the penitentiary is a potential identification for the final examination. If you look at the word, you kind of see what it's all about, to pay penance, to pay for your sins, basically. And so what this became was this novel American approach to the issues of crime and punishment, which we begin to be experimented upon in the North in the antebellum period. Now, if you go back far enough in time, and the history of crime and punishment is really interesting stuff. I have a great book on that I really did enjoy, I have to tell you. But if you go back far enough, and it doesn't, not to go too much farther back from the antebellum period, you come to a time when crime was basically synonymous with sin. So criminals were sinners, and sinners were people who were damned. Remember that the Puritans would say there's the saved and the damned. Well, the damned people, as the saved people manifest their salvation, the damned people manifest their damnation, and they manifest it through their criminal behavior. Now, because they equated crime with sin, and that the criminal was a damned person, it also meant that there's not much you can do about that. And Jojo's having a heck of a time up here. There's not much you can do about that. So the only thing you could do about a criminal, and a criminal is a sinner and damned to hell basically, is to try to get them to stop their criminal behavior. And you would do it in one of two ways. There would either be corporal punishment, and that's the punishment of the body. So you would whip them, flog them, or something like that. And I remember reading the book that the thief would be taken to the pillory, and he'd have his ear nailed into the post there, and be stuck there all day as people walked by, spitting on him, throwing rocks, and the ear would be chopped off, or they'd brand a T on the cheek for it to be a thief or something like that. And what they hoped was that the punishment, the pain of the punishment, would be would deter the individual from committing the criminal activity. Now that was the way to deal with the lesser crimes, right? The more heinous crimes, the way that you would deal with that. Remember that you can't fix this person. You just have to try to stop them is through capital punishment. And if you think about it, capital is the removal of the head. You're taking away the ability of the person to live anymore. And this would be used routinely, of course. And back in the battle days, of course, they had incredible ways to execute people. The breaking on the wheel, the guy would be tied down, and they would break every single bone in the body on their way to ultimately, not just, of course, kill them, but torture them on the way to ultimately executing them. So this is the old notion. Crime is synonymous with sin. There's nothing you can do about that, of course, except to physically threaten the person so that they won't do it, or kill them if, of course, their crime is too heinous. Well, as you can imagine, as you move into the more modern world, a more egalitarian kind of notion, a time of increased sense of personal liberty. The Constitution says no cruel and unusual punishments, of course. That's subject to interpretation, but still, you can imagine there were so many cruel and very usual punishments that had been there before. Clearly, they're turning away from that kind of situation. But they began, for the first time ever, they began to study criminal behavior in the early 19th century. And they realized that there were some that were pathologically criminal. And of course, if that's the case, there's nothing you can really do about that, right? But generally, they thought that the vast majority of criminals were criminals for socioeconomic reasons. There is something that has driven them. They're not inherently criminal in their behavior, but something has driven them to that. And of course, it could be their socioeconomic status, that they were super poor. More routinely in those periods, when they really looked at the problem, they thought that it was the result of a lost youth, of course, of a wild youth, that there had been no parent, parents lacking, or drunken parents, or abusive parents. And those parents had never really taught or guided the individual in the ways that they should behave. So these were all, and what began as kind of juvenile delinquency evolved to be adult criminal behavior. And so what happened was, these reformers who studied this situation believed that they could solve the problem. And they came up with the concept of the penitentiary. The basic notion is that you can redeem these people, right? It's not that they're lost totally. It's not sin and damnation. It's instead just a person who has gone astray. And then what you need to do is to fix that, to bring them back to the right path. Now, remember, be aware that a penitentiary is punishment, okay? An individual commits a crime, they're going to be punished. But the penitentiary, instead of the corporal or capital punishment, was the punishment of incarceration. So you're going to put the person behind bars. They're going to spend time, where they are not free to go where they want to go. So there's punishment. They're not saying there's not going to be punishment. You're going to be punished. But the base idea is that incarceration could become rehabilitation. You could fix the person. You put them in the penitentiary, and you can begin to solve the problems. You can be the guidance and be the parent that hadn't been there in the beginning, to reshape, re-educate, and maybe the word brainwash is not inappropriate. Transform the person back where they are actually rehabilitated. And I got to tell you, in the minds of these very enthusiastic reformers, they believe that you put the person in the penitentiary, you incarcerate them, and of course, you can rehabilitate them, and you will redeem them and send them back out of the world. When they walk out of that penitentiary, they're going to be a good citizen who's going to do all the things that they need to do, okay? Now, the penitentiary, first of all, just what they were in terms of structure. They were prisons, okay? Remember that there is a punishment, and the punishment is incarceration. So penitentiaries are in the guise or the physical form of a prison. I do want you to know that one of the essences of the penitentiary was that everything should be orderly. Again, symmetry and order were key in the building of the buildings, the way the buildings looked, the way that the buildings could be acted upon, because they believed that the more order you brought into the life of the criminal, the more that you could begin to try to redeem them. They had certain interesting things that they wanted to do. They wanted to bring an absolute kind of order to the life of these individuals. This says order is unfortunate, but I just wanted the order part of it. Order to the lives of the individuals. They would bring them into the penitentiary. They would stick them in a cell, and one of the base concepts was of isolation. So what you're doing is you're isolating them from the rest of the world, and you're allowing then the penitentiary to be this guiding entity, like this super stern parent that will begin to teach them. And I have to tell you that some of these things were really hard on the individual, the inmates of the penitentiary. Isolation, at least in its model form, was absolute. No other contact with anyone except for the institutional structure of the penitentiary, so the guards and others involved. In some cases, absolute silence, and I got to tell you, it did drive people crazy. Isolation and silence. So silence. Part of these things were not necessarily going to be functional, but the other things were just creating a sense of regularity in the life. If their mom and dad hadn't taught them the basic components of just behavior, then the penitentiary is going to do it. So, regularity in terms of getting up every morning at a certain time, going to bed at a certain time, of course. Notions of hygiene. You should take care of yourself, of course. Take a bath, shave, brush your teeth, don't forget to floss, all that kind of stuff. There would be educational opportunities, and that still happens. Penitentiaries often have college professors that come there. My daughter was involved in an activity like that when she was at UC Santa Barbara. So, give them an education. Teach them good work skills. You guys all know penitentiaries often have kind of a work dynamic that they're making. Traditionally the idea was that they're making license plates for cars and things like that, okay? But just give them all of these foundations that they hadn't got in the outdoor world, outside the penitentiary, and instill in them, and one thing I didn't write, a heavy dose of evangelical Christianity, of course, that was a powerful part of the whole thing too. All of these things would be used as tools, of course, to begin to redeem the individual, rehabilitate them and redeem them. And, very optimistic perspective on all of this, of course, that the individual criminal is redeemable. You can rehabilitate that person. You can use all these various devices, and, this will transform the person. And when they walk out of the penitentiary, they will be a good, solid citizen. That, at least, was the hope, of course. And that was the experiment. And by the way, that is why Alexis de Tocqueville came to America to study these penitentiary. How's this working, basically? Anyway, the question is, of course, did it work? And the answer is not really. But I do want you to know that it's not that it couldn't have worked. That it could maybe. The isolation is problematic. The silence, of course, is killer, basically. But, can you redeem these people? Could you re-educate them? The problem was it was just so costly to do so. I think you actually can, and there's tons of stories of rehabilitation, even in our penitentiaries today, of those that can become caught up in the dynamics of rehabilitation, the educational process. So many of them are caught up instead, of course, in the culture of criminality and recidivism. They just become better criminals when they go to the penitentiary as they intermix with all these people. But the reason it didn't work was it was so damn expensive. It's still super expensive. It's amazing to me that the amount of money that they pay to maintain a convict in one of our penitentiaries or our prisons, if you gave that person that amount of money outside of the penitentiary, that would be a good living for that person. This is a long time ago, way back in the early 90s, but Kevin Garrett told me that I think that New York State was paying around $67,000 per individual inmate per year. And in those days, that would have actually been a pretty damn good salary. That person probably could have lived a pretty good life outside, but so expensive. So difficult to isolate. If every single prisoner has to have an isolated cell, that means that the prison has to get huge. And you guys know that we have this huge prison population. And it wasn't the same, of course, in the 19th century, but it was growing all the time. And indeed, of course, it became impossible to isolate. So pretty soon it's 2 in a cell and maybe 4 in a cell. And as soon as you do that, of course, the community of the criminal, the culture of the criminality begins to develop itself. Okay, so they just, could it have worked? It could, but it's like a super expensive process which the larger society was unwilling to pay. But the penitentiary simply shows a dedication to the notion of the institution and at least an attempt to confront the problems of crime and punishment in the North in the antebellum period. The institution would manifest in other ways too to deal with other problems. So, the problem of intellectually and mentally challenged people that were simply part of the larger, and have always been part of the larger community. It was that they kind of just wandered the countryside, of course, the crazy person who was just part of the town and village situation, village idiot. I was trying to think of what the classic word was, village idiot. And by the way, in those days, insanity and idiocy were actually, those were diagnostic terms, of course, that they would use. They even used lunatic. That would mean moonstruck, struck by the moon. Well, they decided to try, they didn't like this kind of, scattering of just, and there were times where like individuals or families were like chained in their cellars or something like that. There was a whole bunch of horror stories about this. So the idea was to bring those who were intellectually and mentally challenged into something that they called the Insane Asylum. And again, it's a kind of very basic understanding that these people's lives had become grotesquely disordered. And what you need to do is bring order to their lives, and the Insane Asylum was designed to do that. And in some cases, in really kind of harsh ways. So for instance, one of the great inventions of the early Insane Asylum was the straitjacket, right? And the whole idea is that if the person is physically out of control, then you force them into control. You capture their arms, their legs, their body, and do that. And one of the saddest part about it, some of these people were epileptics. They weren't even, there was nothing wrong with them other than that. And so here's an epileptic in a straitjacket, of course, forcing the person to stay still if they could. Ultimately, the Insane Asylum, of course, will develop a very bad rap, as you know, into the 20th century. You would go to these places, of course, and they were just these awful storage locations for these people living in their own awful, people that were handcuffed to the chairs, kept on drugs. One flew over the cuckoo's nest. You just keep everyone massively sedated, of course, so you can control this particular population. All of these things, of course, discredited the concept of the Insane Asylum. But then the tragedy, of course, is we deinstitutionalize and they go back out on the street again, right? We have a huge homeless population, and many of them, of course, have these sorts of challenges, and which makes for a very bad situation. But the Insane Asylum was an attempt to bring order to the chaos associated with insanity, of course, and those who are mentally and intellectually challenged. The poorhouse was an idea too, to deal with poverty, to bring the poor people into some particular location, of course, to sustain them, of course, but also to control them so they wouldn't just become homeless. And again, we deinstitutionalized the poorhouse, of course, and so that means that poverty just has to go back, spreading out onto the street. And as you guys know, it's become just a humanitarian crisis as far as the United States is concerned. So, not only does this show us that the North was interested in using institutions, but it also shows us that there are increased problems in the North because of crime, because of, people with intellectual and mental challenges, because, of course, of poverty. All these things are really emerging, and there is change in the North. There's no doubt about that, and some of the changes are, causing all kinds of issues within the society, and the Northerners are continually trying to confront it as best they possibly can. Now, of all those kind of manifestations of reform that began to come forward in the antebellum period, one of the most ultimately impactful was the rise of what I'll simply call the anti-slavery impulse. So this is something that began to really come into play. It wasn't involving all Northerners, but increasingly more and more Northerners, and I think ultimately the majority of Northerners at least tended towards the idea of anti-slavery. But this became increasingly a focal point. Now it's interesting because in the North, these reformers are trying to redeem America. And there's a powerful evangelical component to this. And it's like, you can't fix America, and you can't expect Jesus to come back to America unless you get rid of the chief sin of America. And the sin of America, the existential sin of America in the minds of these individuals, was slavery. Slavery dated all the way back to 1619 when that ship came in, of course, and unloaded that portion of a cargo, including 20 and odd African slaves. Slavery had developed into a significant economic institution with deep ties to the society and the politics, especially of the South. The Constitution upheld slavery. The Southern states, of course, absolutely upheld it. You have a powerful elite group of slave owners who have exerted a tremendous amount of political, social, and economic power across the entire nation. I mean, increasingly for many Northerners, this became the chief problem of America. This was the chief sin of America, and the thing that Americans had to overcome if they were to move forward in any kind of meaningful way. Now, we call it the anti-slavery impulse, because this means you're against slavery. But it is interesting to note that the degree of anti-slaveryness, is kind of changes over time. In the beginning, it was like the Quakers during the colonial period were the first, slavery is a bad idea, and of course for primarily religious reasons. When the revolution comes along, many more Northerners say, slavery, that doesn't jive with our sense of liberty and equality, they're going to get rid of it. Even, as tobacco began to decline, even in the South, you had anti-slavery expression from plantation owners like Thomas Jefferson, always railing kind of against slavery. George Washington, not quite so vocal, but actually freeing his slaves. He freed about 32 slaves, not until his death, but he did free them. We have to appreciate that side of it. So there had been like an anti-slavery expression in America for a long time, but something was new and different now. And those who were promoting anti-slavery decided that anti-slavery wasn't a strong enough way of describing their feelings about the situation. So instead, they began to promote abolitionism, and they called themselves the abolitionists. And the abolitionists, of course, are the powerful northern anti-slavery expression that began to emerge in the antebellum period. Now I'm going to do just a simple kind of analysis of the abolitionists. And the first thing is, so what were the abolitionists? I wish I would have said abolitionists instead of abolitionism, but I messed things up, all right? So what were the abolitionists? They're just people, of course, but their primary goal is, I'm going to call it anti-slavery propagandists. These were anti-slavery propagandists. So that means that they were going to go on the attack against slavery in every way they could. Now you all know that, generally speaking, the only medium they would have had at that time would have been, unless they were just speaking personally, of course, orations, or they did do plays, was through the printed media. So we're going to see, beginning really in the 1820s and just exploding through the 1830s, just this raft of anti-slavery propaganda coming from the abolitionists in the form of journals and newspapers and books that they would write and speeches that they would deliver, songs that would be sung, of course, marches that would be marched, signs that would be held, of course, just again and again and again, putting it in the face of America that slavery is a sin, and the only way to redeem this nation, of course, is to get rid of it. So the primary goal of these individuals was as anti-slavery propagandists. Among them, and I have to tell you that probably the most popular and impactful book of the era was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this book, of course, and it's just an extraordinary book. It's a fictional tale. But in the book, of course, the heroes are the slaves and the villains are the white slave owners and those associated with them. And the heroic activities, the slaves trying to run away, of course, from them. And the book became a national bestseller. It became an international bestseller. It had a huge impact. And what Stowe was trying to do was to convince more and more Americans that slavery isn't evil. It's a terrible thing. And if you read that book, of course, that's the exact same image you're going to get. I do want you to know that in the aftermath of the Civil War, Harriet Beecher Stowe was in England, and she met with the English Prime Minister. I can never remember if it was Gladstone or Disraeli, but it was one of those two guys. These are famous prime ministers of that era. And when whichever one of them shook the hand of Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So you're the little lady who caused the Civil War," What a heavy burden to put upon someone. But her anti-slavery propaganda had been powerful, and it had changed the minds of a lot of people. So it doesn't cause a civil war directly, but it does create the environment of antagonism that will lead us to the Civil War. So what were the abolitionists? They were anti-slavery propagandists. Now, one of the more interesting questions is why. Slavery was not new. I think you guys all know that slavery is not new in America. So why in the world did all of a sudden, in the 1820s and 1830s, all these Northerners get so hot and bothered by this situation and rise up against it in the ways that they will do so? Now, the answer to me is primarily one of timing. So what that means is that you're getting a new generation of Americans who, and the primary issue was that they were the first group of Americans who had no personal relationship whatsoever to slavery. If you were born in the colonial period, even in the North, there were slaves, okay? If you were born in the very beginning of the Republican, there's still some slaves there. It's not until 1810 that you're absolutely beginning to remove slavery from the North, and even then there's a little bit of grandfathering that's taking place. But by the time we get to the 1820s and 30s, there's a generation of Americans who know nothing, have no contact to slavery. And because of that, they can turn against it and they can be hostile to it in a way that, no generation could have before. I mean, it's just so interesting when you see this generational dynamic, and it's happened in my lifetime in a number of ways. The attitudes towards smoking. When I was a kid, some people walked into my house, sat down in my living room. That wasn't my mom and dad's living room. And they lit up a cigarette. They didn't ask anybody if they could do that. And all the mom would say is, Chris, could you go run and get an ashtray? Because that was simply accepted. And when I remember driving out to the desert with my Duff and his dad, in the cab of their pickup truck, and Bill Wiley is chain smoking like it's going on a sal, and the entire cab is just filled with smoke, and I hated every second of it. But I didn't say anything, because there was no sense that I had any right to say. That's his personal right to smoke, and that's just the way it is. And they smoked in theaters, and they smoked on airplanes, and they smoked in classroom. I mean, that's the one that always freaks me out. You could see some professor in there puffing on his pipe in a classroom. That's the way it was in those days. And yet, we turned against smoking in a dramatic way. And first we segregated, of course, the smoking section, the non-smoking section, and then we eliminated. I mean, our attitudes towards smoking has changed dramatically over the course of just my lifetime. It can happen, And there's a new generation of Americans, and it's just interesting, we are smoking so much less, of course, and then all of a sudden you get the scourge of vaping coming into play, which sounds like it's not much better. In fact, in some cases it can be significantly worse, So anyway, but now smokers are like an oppressed minority, that we shove off to the back of some place. They're back behind smoking their cigarettes in the back of behind the store or something like that. These are the kind of things that can change dramatically. Attitudes towards homosexuality have changed dramatically over my lifetime. I have to admit to you that when I was a kid, I was basically homophobic, and I don't know how I could not have been homophobic. My mom and dad had a homosexual friend. And I must admit I didn't really realize that. I was just a little kid. And he took me fishing one day, and I have to tell you, it was the best day of fishing I've ever had in my entire life. And later on I found out he was gay, and I said, Mom, how could you let me to go fishing? And of course, there's no reason why I shouldn't have gone, and my mom was very unhappy with me. But it also created a stereotype in my mind that gay people are really good fishermen. I'm not exactly sure that that's true, but then of course, our society opens up increasingly to gay activities and behaviors, and we have the first kiss between men on TV. And then Ellen comes out, of course, and Ellen paid a super high price in her sitcom for coming out. The sitcom was canceled relatively quickly. But, increasingly attitudes are changing. And now we love Ellen. Ellen is like one of the great saints of America, basically. I've been to great gay weddings now. When there is a homosexual relationship in terms of a movie or television show, I'm often rooting for them because I just think they're such a perfect couple, and I just hope that they get together. This is the change of attitudes can occur, of course. And what happened in the antebellum period, it was the first significant generation of Northerners who simply had no connection to slavery, and therefore they could turn against it in a fairly powerful way. Which leads me to my last kind of question about the abolitionists, like who are these people? And I'm sure you guys can guess that they were primarily the northern middle class. They're not going to be Southerners. If you're a Southern abolitionist, you better get the hell out of Dodge, right? Things are not going to go well for you. Sarah and Angelica Grimke from South Carolina, the daughters of a plantation owner, began to be anti-slavery, of course. And I got to tell you, they had to move to the north. It's just not going to work out. So primarily the northern middle class, many of them who were engaged in the revival activities, many of them were evangelical Christians who saw slavery as basically a sin. It is so interesting, of course, that Northerners could use the Bible against slavery and Southerners could use the Bible to support slavery. It does actually work both ways if you look into the Bible, but these are the kind of people who began to turn against it. I do want you to know that they were always a minority. In fact, you could almost call them lunatic fringe as far as the society is concerned. But it's primarily the northern middle class that become the heart and soul. By the way, that makes me think of something that I missed with you guys. So I told you that the primary activity was anti-slavery propagandists. Some of them are willing to go far beyond that. In some ways, I have a similar kind of understanding of the abolitionists and the anti-abortionist people of today. In one aspect, in the absolutism of their attitude, right? For the abolitionists, there was no compromising, of course. Slavery has to be gone. With the anti-abortionists, there's no compromising with abortion, of course. And most of anti-abortionists are simply anti-abortion propagandists. So that means that they're going to speak and express themselves and march and carry signs and do everything they can to try to let people know that abortion is a terrible thing, of course, and to transform the situation and to get rid, of course, of abortion in America. The other side, though, here's one other comparison which I think is, makes a lot of sense. Yes, most of the abolitionists were anti-slavery propagandists, and yes, most of the anti-abortionists are anti-abortion propagandists. But when you have this kind of a perspective, it does allow, it often causes sort of a pathological expression. So that means that there are anti-abortionists who are willing to kill, right? They're going to go kill a doctor. They're going to go blow up an abortion clinic. They're going to physically confront people who are trying to get in and out of, and of course, you guys know that those are like the behaviors that have been there. Of course, now much more subtle, continually legal attacks upon abortion that become sort of a hallmark of our moment. And I have no idea where that's all leading. But the anti-slavery, the abolitionists were similar in that activity. There were some abolitionists who were willing to take the gun and go south, of course, and start killing slave owners if they possibly could. And among, the greatest examples of that is like John Brown. John Brown becomes a radical abolitionist, willing to put his body on the line, of course, to foment revolution, to liberate the slaves in whatever way he possibly could. So, what were they? Anti-slavery propagandists, but I'm sorry I forgot that part. They were also, there's a pathological expression which was willing to use violence to get rid of slavery if they could. Now, who were they? Generally the northern middle class, there's no doubt about that. But, when you do abolitionists, you really kind of want to focus on the particular. So I will tell you about two abolitionists, and I'm first going to start with the most famous abolitionist by far, and his name was William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison has got to be considered the most famous of all of the abolitionists. Now, if you saw William Lloyd Garrison walking down the street in Boston in the 1830s, when he's really beginning to be kind of prominent abolitionist figure, you probably wouldn't be tremendously impressed by him. He was a short individual, just about 5 feet tall. Not that there's anything wrong with short people. I think short people are really wonderful. He was bald. Not that there's anything wrong with being bald, of course. I think bald men are extremely attractive. What can I say? He looked like a librarian. He wore these little teeny, wire-rimmed glasses, kind of John Lennon glasses. Not known very well, but John Lennon glasses were originally called William Lloyd Garrison glasses. But, he looked like this librarian. So there's short, bald librarian. By the way, librarians are wonderful people, So all these things, great. But he wasn't necessarily the most physically impressive individual. He's a short, bald, bespectacled man, okay? But in that little man was the heart of a lion, just the heart of a dedicated individual to abolition, doing everything he possibly could to try to combat slavery. Now, what was William Lloyd Garrison? I've already told you what he was, right? He's an anti-slavery propagandist. He's one of these people who's going to do everything he possibly can to bring down slavery, of course, through the various mediums that he had available. His chief medium, the device that he would use to attack slavery, was a journal that he wrote. One of the greatest of the anti-slavery journals, and it was called The Liberator, first published in 1831. On the Liberator, he made a promise to everyone, and it said, this will be published the day slavery is abolished in the United States of America. He used as that date the Emancipation Proclamation Day, which I think is interesting because there's still going to be a lot of slavery, but I guess that was enough. The commitment to anti-slavery the end of slavery was expressed by the Emancipation Proclamation. He also would routinely include on the masthead, there's like a slave standing there with chains and shackles, and the slave is pulling the chains and they're exploding, an expression, of course, a symbolic expression, iconic suggestion, of course, of abolitionism. But his primary medium was this journal called The Liberator. Now, on the very first edition of The Liberator, he takes up the entire front page to make his statement, the mission statement of what he's going to do. And he's just, it's a long paragraph, and at the very end, it goes from, just regular printing to bold all caps. And bold all caps, of course, is basically like someone shouting at you. It's the way that you write, but you're shouting at people. It's always intriguing to me that when I read a paper a student's written and it's all in caps, I kind of feel like they're shouting at me. That's the way that we're programmed to respond to that. But I wish I could remember the entire line, but at the very end he says, I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, these other things. He ends it with, I will be hurt, I will be hurt. You are not going to be able to avoid me and ignore me. I'm going to put the word out there so aggressively that you can't believe it, of course, and I'm going to go after everyone who is in support of slavery until we get done with this damn thing. It became his essential objective to drive America towards the end of slavery in whatever way he could. So what he did, of course, was he simply went on the attack. He's going to attack anybody who's in any way supportive of slavery. So, of course, he attacked the South. You're going to go after the South and the Southern politicians whenever way you possibly could. And his attack on the South was so effective that, I mean, you can see this in the response of the Southerners. The state of South Carolina put a price on his head, $20,000, dead or alive. $20,000 was an enormous amount of money in those days. So that meant if he stepped over the boundary into South Carolina, you could shoot him dead and drag him into the authorities and get a reward for him. And of course, he never went to South Carolina, but to me that shows that, how much the Southerners despised him, essentially. But it wasn't just the South. He went after Northern businessmen. So if you're a Northern businessman and you've got ties to the South, he wanted to let people know, and he put their names in the Liberator. So and so has economic activities engaged with Mississippi or something like that. And sometimes these businesses would sue him, but of course it wasn't liable to tell the truth. He was simply stating fact that they were functioning with the Southerners. He attacked churches. So if you're of a denomination like the Baptist and you're connected to the Southern Baptist, then you're in league with the devil. If you continue interactions with the Southerners, these are bad people. These are the slave owners. You're not doing the right thing. And he, of course, even went after the government. He knew the government was fundamentally underwriting slavery in one way or the other. And he on one very famous occasion, he publicly burned a copy of the Constitution. The Constitution is a sacred document of the United States of America. You can say that's no big deal, but I remember watching some drafted individuals burning their draft cards. It was pretty powerful when I saw that. And if any one of us took a flag out in the middle of Palomar College and burned it, these are symbolically powerful things that would take place. But he just simply wanted to show the people that the Constitution is problematic in the way that it does indeed uphold slavery. And even went after Lincoln. He said Lincoln's he's too slow. We got to move quickly. We've got to end slavery as quickly as he possibly can. So here's someone who's really going to aggressively go against anything that connects to slavery. He did promote, here's the positive side, very much a promoter of African American rights. There were some abolitionists that were racist. That's clearly one component of the story of the abolitionists. So they hated slavery, but they didn't want to live with black people. So many of them had the notion of colonization. So we liberate them from slavery and we take them back to Africa so we don't have to live with them. And Garrison was very much against that. He said, hell no, these people have lived here, they have worked here, they have sweated here, they've suffered to make our economy work. They deserve every single right that any white American would. We call him a racial liberal. He believes in the equality between white and black, and that's a fairly unique position at that time. He was also a promoter of women's rights. He wanted to guarantee, he thought women deserved all of the equal rights that men would have. Although he always said that you fight against slavery first and you fight for the women's situation second. So that was always going to be like a second place issue as far as he was concerned. I do want to mention one other thing about William Lloyd Garrison. He was a believer in nonviolence, but he was such a radical in many of his expressions. He was kind of constantly under physical threat. This is in the North. Northerners didn't like this guy. This guy is a radical. He's promoting all kinds of crazy notions. Of course, he's stirring the pot, making problems, more problematic than they were before. And on more than one occasion, he was threatened with violence by mobs. And I have to tell you that on one time, it's kind of good to be like a little small guy. So I think some of his supporters, they kind of grabbed him and they threw him through a window to get him out of harm's way. They could just kind of discard him that way. But one of the things about this nonviolence kind of situation is that, I kind of suggest to you if you had walked by him on the streets of Boston, you might not have noticed him because he was this diminutive, bald, librarian-looking guy. Not that there's any, diminutive, bald librarians are really super good people, okay? But, he was always followed, though, by a posse of very substantial physical black men. And the black men followed him around because they realized that he was at risk and they didn't want him to get beat up. So it would have been a very interesting sight to see little old William Lloyd Garrison followed by some big black guys behind him, with clubs and stuff like that, offering to protect him. Well, Garrison is famous not only for being the most prominent of all the abolitionists, but he was also famous for identifying the most famous of the black abolitionists. And that individual was, you guys should know this, of course, Frederick Douglass. And so I'm going to do Frederick Douglass for you. I want you to know that I'm depending on you to know Frederick Douglass, because you're going to read the narrative. The narrative story. God, I don't have a memory problem. The book on Frederick Douglass that I told you, a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. It finally came to me. So I'm just going to give you a couple of particulars, which I hope I will see on the potential identification that will be coming down. He was born in either 1817 or 1818. You guys know that this is one of the indications of slavery. the fact that oftentimes people didn't even know when they were born and would not have a birthday, which seems like a really sad part of the equation. He experienced so much, of course, of just the dynamics of slavery in so many ways. He saw the violence of it, people beaten, people whipped, people killed. This is just something that he grew up with, basically. He will come out of, that experience, with, or that youth, with one really critical kind of experience, sent to Baltimore to become basically a babysitter for a member of the extended family. The kid was 4 years old and Douglas was 7. And as the mother taught her son to read and write, then Frederick Douglass sort of gravitated into the circle of learning, which lasted until the husband came home one day, of course, and he will say words that just will ultimately resonate with Frederick Douglass. He said, "It's against the law. Honey, you can't do that. It's against the law to teach a slave how to read and write." But he also said, it will ruin a good slave if you teach them to read and write. And of course, you guys all know that it ruined Frederick Douglass. He was a horrible slave, but of course he would become a great man, and that's the kind of the critical situation. One of the more dramatic stories, of course, is when he was sent to the slave breaker, because he wasn't a good slave. And the fact that he beat up the slave breaker is just a stunning expression of this time. Routinely that would result in death, but there's some logic that the slave breaker didn't want people to know that he'd been beaten up, of course, so he kind of let it slide rather than make some kind of a big point of it. It did, however, the whole experience left, of course, Douglas just depressed. He knew that there was something more to his life, especially through his various activities of reading, and so ultimately it will drive him, in some cases to contemplate suicide, but more importantly to contemplate running away. And he will run away about the age of 18 or 19. An interesting kind of device. He was in Maryland. He had relative freedom to kind of move around. He got himself a sailor outfit so he could pretend and look like he was a sailor. He forged his own documents, and this is where you play racism against itself. So the white people couldn't believe that a black person could write, let alone read or write, let alone actually make the documentation. And if you make them look good enough, of course, everyone's going to believe that. And he got himself in a sailor outfit. I think it's interesting. You think you're going to go by the boat, but instead he went by train first from Baltimore up to Philadelphia and ultimately to New York. Believe it or not, it wasn't really safe in either Philadelphia or New York City. So he made his way to Massachusetts, to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and there he would run into the realm kind of the abolitionists and to receive some kind of protection, know that he was safe at some point. He went to a meeting relatively quickly in terms of the abolitionists. And one thing that the abolitionists loved was to hear the stories of the runaway slaves. They thought these things were great. So Frederick Douglass stands up to give his story, his account, and he does it with such articulation and power that Garrison is like, "Oh my God, man, you're amazing." And so he will he will ask, and of course Douglass will agree to become a spokesperson for the abolitionist cause. And he was just so good as a spokesperson. Tall, 6'2", handsome, really distinct features. He had that incredible kind of hair that he sort of tried to part and explodes this way, explodes that way, but just an amazing, good, powerful voice. Incredible story. I mean, that's the thing that often makes, the speaker so incredible. He would stand before the people. He would say, "I stand before you a thief and a robber. I stole these arms. I stole these legs. I stole this body, of course, from my master." And, he had to steal his own body to be able to get to freedom. And of course, they were tremendously impressed by him and just tremendously impressed by his story. He was a little too impressive to some degree, so many people didn't believe that he'd ever been a slave, that they thought he was kind of a plant and maybe he was from Great Britain or something like that, So he had to write a story. That's the reason I'm going to write this out so that this is the truth. And he actually did contract to purchase his own freedom at some point, didn't want to have that hanging over that he was a fugitive slave during all this time. But anyway, critical in terms of promoting the cause of abolitionism. During the war, he promoted the cause of black soldiers. He said to Lincoln, "Put a gun in the hand of the black man and he will turn south and not give up," right? Because he has to continue to fight for his people. In the aftermath of the Civil War, became a proponent of black civil rights, all these kind of things. Living the difficult existence of a distinguished black man in a very racist white society, but still Frederick Douglass, a critical expression of the abolitionist movement in the antebellum period. Now, I do want you to know that the abolitionists were basically lunatic fringe. And they were in many ways seen as a thorn in the side of the North, let alone the South. But what their goal was, of course, they're propagandists, and what you're trying to do, they're anti-slavery propagandists, and what you're trying to do, of course, is turn the people against slavery. So by the time we get to 1860, although the average Northerner would not have been an abolitionist, Abraham Lincoln is not an abolitionist. Now, Abraham Lincoln didn't like the abolitionists. He thought they were just really problematic, But Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery, and the average Northerners are anti-slavery. So most Northerners are not abolitionists, but almost, most of them are indeed anti-slavery. So they were turning the attitude of the nation, of the North, not everybody, of course, of the North, against the South, against slavery, and so it has a profound impact. And I also want you guys to know that the abolitionists, of course, are going to deeply trouble the Southerners, and the Southerners will begin to look at the North as if they are a bunch of abolitionists, of course. So this becomes a driving wedge between the North and the South. And I will want to look at the South when we come back as soon as I can, okay?